Howdy.
Hey, how are you?
Not bad. Today we're going to go over alternative head injury protocol, genetic testing, and brain scans.
So we both worked on this paper. There were also several other people that were involved in this piece of publishing. They were Dr. Anna Pope, University of Kansas, Dr. Merlin Butler from the University of Kansas Health System, Dr. Bruce Capo from Clinical Associates in Lenexa, Kansas, Dr. Laura Morris from the Department of Neurology in Sarasota, Florida, and also Arthur Burrows from the Union Center for Cultural and Environmental Research, Ulster Park, New York. Yeah, so this came out in September.
This year.
We'd kind of been working on it for at least a semester or two, right?
I started it in 2020 at KU, and you had started it before that while you were at St. Mary's. Because we did the original interviews when I first came up here. What was that, 2017 or 18?
We did the interviews in spring of 2019. That kind of springboarded off of a class I was taking, and we kind of used them to explore the head injury protocol. And
I was having a difficult time finding anyone that would address head injuries. I really only found, and it wasn't even really me, it was my folks and family and friends were trying to find a program that would address the problem with head injuries. We found University of Toronto from the hockey program, from the sports program, BU, Stanford, KU, and Pacific Northwest. Vancouver also had a program, but a lot of them weren't taking applicants because they were full. So this was kind of what we ran into with limitations with treatment. NYU and Columbia both have treatment, but that, as we mentioned before, took 22 months just to get the appointment. And with head injuries, you want to address it pretty much as soon as possible.
right, I think in the head injury recovery community, it's pretty well known that your best chances for repair and restoration are definitely within the first year.
Indeed.
So I think part of that led into developing some more programs, because 22 months is a long time when it's kind of a critical period for recovery in there, those first 12 months or so.
Yes, and I had other responsibilities that I wasn't really grasping, and that just dragged down the pre-diagnosis at NYU. So they diagnosed a concussion in, 12. By 13, I was having memory problems. It was pre-diagnosed at the end of 13, but then I wasn't formally diagnosed until 16. That's much too long.
In 2016.
Yes,
So,
that's
okay.
That's where I got my formal diagnosis from Dr. Morris, and then she sent me over to Dr. Rubino, who did the PET scans. And that's when they started looking for a rehabilitation program, which was non-existent pretty much.
Right, so that led you to Kansas. I know did you get referred to a doctor here? I know it took a while to kind of get some rehabilitation stuff going here as well.
Yeah, originally it was a Bay neurology but they handle brain surgery, more Parkinson's disease and ALS. I had been also pre-diagnosed with OI, which is a bone disorder.
What does that stand for?
Osteogenesis imperfecta.
Okay.
And you don't retain vitamin D. And I was having symptoms from that, not knowing what it was. We found out later that the OI needed genetic verification, which hadn't been done. And while I was at Bay, they suggested going to the University of Kansas, which I was already looking at rehabilitation and social work here in Kansas City. And that's
right,
when you started to do the journaling and really putting together how this was unfolding.
And was it from Dr. Morris that, I know you're already looking at Kansas, but part of rehabilitation after a TBI was keeping the brain active. So going back to school or having some kind of academic goals was part of treatment to kind of repair the connections there and keep the brain active and healthy, right?
Yeah, her assessment and what she spoke to us about was very different than what the medical profession. The medical profession had me strengthening and physicality, maxillofacial surgery, repairing the eye that was damaged and the injury, handling the physicality, which was very good, but that doesn't help the brain itself. She was the first person to say, wait a minute, you need a form of rehabilitation that is addressing the plasticity of the organ. And it should be something novel, something new that you don't know, that will enable the brain to become more active and repair itself. I guess a problem is when they're fixing and repairing the structure, they want you to be immobile, but that's the worst thing for a brain injury. Really, you need to be activating neurons and stabilizing the damage internally, which you can only do through accessing different platforms, working on computers. Originally, there was a lot of do crossword puzzles and things of that nature. Laura Morris kind of reeled everybody in and said, no, you don't need hospital treatment, hospitalization, or even outpatient therapy that is currently the protocol for head injury. What you really need to do is get into a program where you're finishing the degree you started, or in a science program or something of interest. So I actually went to work at GTI or GAI, General Auto International, GAI.
Okay.
And they own several companies. But learning their programs, even though I had a lot of problems with dyscalculia and the other things that we were discovering, it was good to learn, to go through their intake programs and how they handle customer service. And the numbers weren't good because I'm not very accurate with the numbers with synesthesia, but it was good and more effective than playing with rubber bands in the hospital or touching your nose or what is basic rehabilitation protocol for head injuries.
So more like a real world rehabilitation, getting you out there in a position where you're basically doing the same things. You're basically doing the same things, having tactile and sensory triggers that are keeping the brain active. It's just in a real world environment versus inpatient or a hospital environment?
I think real world environment is very important because at that point, when I met you, I hadn't had anybody to mirror and scaffold. So you were regressed to almost a childlike state. Most of the people that I had known up to that point that had head injuries are lower functioning. And we believe it's due to, if you're at a childlike level of mirroring and scaffolding and mimicking people's behavior, you need to fill that void with something that's related to your past to secure those memories that have been disturbed. I think a lot of my floundering happened because I didn't have family support or the support of those who care about you. And without that, you don't get that extra advantage of understanding who you were, seeing pictures, having representations of your life before the injury, which for me pushed further into post-traumatic amnesia. When I got a hold of Dr. Morris and she said, well, put your name on some boards, try to get into a program that specializes in head injury, specifically sports injuries, you'll see more progress. Because I was punching computer numbers and not really grasping it. My cognizance kept getting worse. By the time I met you, I think I wasn't the person I was before the injury, but at the same time, I really wasn't anybody else either. I think I mirrored and framed you, or mirror and scaffold you initially, and then it shifted over to Ruth and people I was working with until I understood that what I was mimicking and mirroring what was surrounding me. So after head injury, particularly close to the injury, you really need to make sure the person's in a place that has a positive, not a negative influence. A negative influence is it's pretty dangerous for a person with a head injury.
Yeah, and that can go for a lot of things in terms of recovery, how it affects the body and the brain and everything. You just need to be in a good place to give your body the best chance, put it in the best position to heal.
Yeah, I think when I first got to KU and we realized that a bay was for neuroscience surgery and it may become helpful in the future, but the first thing was to kind of establish who was I or where was I headed at the injury point. I think that was the key. I think early on you said literature. Isn't that how we started talking, was about reading and literature? That was, I think, the point where I stopped dealing with the medical, restoring the physicality, and realized that it had to be something to do with the brain itself. And my memory was not very good. But then when we started talking about literature, that's when I kind of started to remember things and jump my mom's books. I think going through books and things like that helped. When I finally got to my folks, those objects were very grounding and gave me some sort of baseline, where before that there was no baseline. I think that's probably the most important thing with head injuries, is that it's understood that until you understand how the brain's damaged and and what areas you need to address, you have to find a baseline for the person. Who were they before? And kind of support that.
Yeah, I forgot about that. I think the literature that I had you look at first was the Space Trilogy by Lewis, C.S. Lewis.
And that was very helpful in uncovering who had I been, where where had I been in my life before this injury. And Lewis was very helpful. Science fiction was very helpful. And then getting to KU and going back through generals was helpful. Actually, I'm remembering also, right at the point of the head injury when we just thought it was a concussion, a person came up to me in the courthouse, because I had been dealing with a custody with my kids, and had said, "Oh, you've had a concussion, you should do the Clemente course. It's for people who have a disability and needs rehabilitation, but not, brain rehabilitation." And they had you basically learn to read and write again and how language is set up. And that was very helpful. And that was within the first 6 months of the injury. It was actually right that first month that I got out of the hospital. I entered the Clemente course for a year. Very helpful course, nationwide course. And at the same time, I had been a pre-qualification coach with the Semper Fi Society. They were also very gracious and helpful with having me continue to coach the pre-qualification applicants. Those two things, one handled the physicality, one handled the brain response. And I think that stabilized things short term. Unfortunately, by June of 13, which would have been about 6 months after the injury, those two things stopped. And that's when I took a nosedive as far as losing my ability to stay upright and to comprehend what was going on. I'd get to a stoplight and forget how to shift gears. I couldn't remember how to get places that I had been going all the time. And those were kind of the cues that maybe I need to find a better route. Since GAI, I wasn't performing well at GAI. Bay Neurology suggested that I look into taking a course or two at a school that would have psychology and some head injury treatments. And that's when I came up to KU. And we found out what was being transferred grade-wise, because I had been a second degree, or I was re-getting a degree that wasn't accredited. So they had me take generals at JCCC. That was a big change, being at JCCC, Johnson Community College. Allowed, you learn to read and write and mathematics and where your strengths and weaknesses are. And that's, I think, when you did those initial interviews where we started to talk about there needs to be a protocol, there needs to be a standard that if a head injury is identified, this is how you'll see the best improvement or the most improvement.
So before that, had you taken psychology or social work classes?
I didn't take social. I did take psychology and philosophy, and then media, which I didn't really grasp. I was still trying to discover what it was I had been doing before. But now it all came together.
Right. So fast forward 2 years, you're almost done with the program, but in the meantime, as you work through the degree, you've got this paper that got published in SunKrist Sports Medicine and Research Journal. We kind of went over where the idea came from, kind of the foundations of it, of some things I was doing at school, and then obviously your experiences through the head injury and some of the treatments that you went through. You've got firsthand experience of what is helpful, what is maybe not as helpful, depending on the person.
It was really Dr. Butler who stepped in and said, this looks, well, your notes, and this looks like a pilot study. Let's run it as a pilot study. And as a writer, then we can publish it. If I had been just the subject, then there's all sorts of HIPAA, what are they called, restrictions, where to bring me in as one of the writers allowed a very intimate view of what this one experience is and how we could formulate a paper outlining head injuries are really more individual and they need to be treated more individual depending on what part of the brain has been affected. That was great insight on his part and your part for doing the journals.
Yeah, I think at some point we'll have to get Dr. Butler to come on here and explain his insights and inspirations and all that kind of stuff. I think that'd be really interesting.
And Dr. Pope's lab, I mean, that allowed us to really find out how medical papers are written and also investigate medical assessments for head injuries, which there isn't really one out there. There's other assessments that allow identification, but the original assessments that identified me were psych assessments, and they just kept getting confused with the symptoms. There we go. SunKrist Sports Medicine and Research Journal.
Right, and I think you already covered, I guess where I came in was more so the head injury protocol stuff. Had heavy medical influence and insights from Dr. Butler and Dr. Morris for the genetic piece, for the brain scan piece.
And I had been prescribed a lot of medications that are outlined here and that weren't compatible with me and the specific injury I had, which was frontal lobe and left lobe. We questioned what would be the benefit of a lot of these. Nutrition was a big breakthrough, like literature, physicality-wise, being cautious of chemistry that's in food production and sourcing good foods.
Right, so that's a piece of alternative head injury protocol, is really getting the genetic piece down for each individual to see what exactly their genetic makeup is, what is going to be most helpful for them, what are things to avoid, that kind of thing. Is that?
And it's helpful. It's helpful with the genetics, understanding that everyone's individual. As people participate, it increases the bank of knowledge or the dictionary. So we have a better understanding of, well, if someone's presenting as autism or someone's presenting as PTSD, they'll be more receptive to this type of treatment, which may be lion's mane or these more natural substances, which when the brain has been damaged are very helpful, where the synthetics, in my particular case, several cases I've seen, seem to impede the regeneration of the neurons.
Mm-hmm. What you said about depending on how a person's symptoms present, it can look very different, and TBI symptoms can mimic mental health disorders.
Yes.
So that's a big issue too, is that a lot of times someone will present looking like they're on the autism spectrum, or they have major depressive disorder, or
schizophrenia, bipolar,
Right. And then you have to really have someone who's very observant or can diagnose that or differentiate mental health from a TBI or the comorbidity. But with the use of a genetic testing with more in-depth battery of tests specifically targeting that, you can differentiate and have treatment be more individualized and specific.
Mm-hmm. Which is what we're all pushing for now, is that we make use of the technology and let people understand that this is very individual, but it's also very helpful as a community to engage treatments that are consistent based on presentation, but also based on people's DNA.
Right. We wouldn't want to accidentally misdiagnose somebody who has a TBI, right? And put them into an inpatient facility when they don't need to be there.
That would really suck.
Well, and the whole idea in mental health care and healthcare is to put people in the least restrictive environments.
That we like to think that that's the objective, as long as they're diagnosed correctly. Sadly, we have a large population that probably is misdiagnosed.
Misdiagnosed, undiagnosed. People don't know how to recognize it or know how to identify it.
And it's strange because the person can physically appear like they're healing, or their injury is gone, the sutures have come out and they've healed, but they're still going through things. And it's not as obvious an injury as a broken leg or being blind or being in a wheelchair. So often it falls through the cracks of people's observation.
Right, so this paper is online. I think we'll put the link up for it.
Yes.
And as this one came out in September, there's also two other papers that have been published or in the process of being published that we can talk about another time.
Yeah, focusing on physical therapy and then a discussion on this paper. That's what we should invite Dr. Butler to speak about, or Dr. Butler and Dr. Pope.
That would be good. It'd be nice to have them on here.
Very good. Until next time.